Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I know there will be a few more folks trickling in over the next couple of minutes, so we will continue to repeat a few housekeeping items, but I wanted to welcome everyone. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Anna Wyeth, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at Sidwell Friends. Welcome to this Conversation with Friends event, highlighting two wonderful alumni, David Vine, who's class of 1993. We're going to be talking about David's forthcoming book this evening, as well as Enid Logan, class of 1990, who's going to be helping to lead our conversation. Just a couple of housekeeping things. For those of you who feel comfortable, I would encourage you to keep your video on. It's a great way to see who else is in the room and really feel like you're engaged. We all wish we could be together in person, which of course we can't right now. As well as your video, if you have a chance and want to rename yourself to include your class year, if you're an alum, or perhaps if you are the parent of an alum or a current or former faculty member, feel free to rename yourself with that info so that everyone can see all of that as well. David and Enid are going to have a conversation. I'm going to formally introduce them in a minute. If you have questions throughout this event, we will have a dedicated Q&A portion towards the end. If you have a question that you'd like to submit and have us ask on your behalf, you can do so through the chat feature, either to myself or my colleague Emma O'Leary, who is also here tonight. Feel free to send us your question and we will ask it during the Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question yourself, just let us know that in the chat as well, and then we'll let you know when it's your turn to ask your question during our Q&A. And we'll keep everyone on mute until then, just to minimize disruptions. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two wonderful speakers this evening. David Vine is the class of 1993, and he is an author and professor of political anthropology at American University here in Washington, D.C. His most recent book, which we're discussing this evening, is The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. And a proposal for the book won the University of California Press Series in Public Anthropology International Book Competition. David is also the author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World, which was published in 2015, and Island of Shame, The Secret History of the U.S. Military Base on Diego Garcia, which was published in 2009. And just as importantly, David has three siblings who were all also Sidwell Friends lifers. Some or all of them are here tonight, along with other family members and dear friends. I'm also very excited to introduce Enid Logan, who's the class of 1990. Enid is an associate professor and associate chair in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota, with specialties in the areas of American Indian racialization, Blackness in America, contemporary US race relations, race and electoral politics, and several more. And her book, titled At This Defining Moment, Barack Obama's Presidential Candidacy and the New Politics of Race, provides a nuanced analysis framed by innovative theoretical insights to explore how Barack Obama's presidential candidacy both reflected and shaped the dynamics of race in the contemporary US. Enid attended Sidwell Friends starting in 3rd grade through graduation, along with her two younger siblings, and we have 3 members of her family in the audience this evening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our 2 speakers, and we thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Okay, can everyone hear me? So we're here to talk about this book. I'm excited to be here to talk about this powerful new book by class of 93 alum David Vine. I know David because he is a friend of my brother. And also David had me Skype into one of his classes at American University, 2012 maybe, to talk about my book on Obama and race. So I am glad to return the favor. Now, this book is a meticulously researched book that was almost 2 decades in the making. When you get the book, you'll see that David's writing style is not overly polemical. He doesn't lecture the reader, but the book is, in the end, a devastating read of American political and military history and what this means for all of our lives today. So there's a lot to discuss here in so many ways into the text. And because our time is quite limited tonight, I'm going to go right into our discussion and exposition of the book to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience and also to allow everyone to get to the vice presidential debate. Okay, so to start, David, why did you want to write this book? And what did you start out by asking? And also, what was the most surprising finding or conclusion that you came to in the process of putting this all together?
So thank you, Enid. Everyone can hear me? Great. I'm really excited to be here. I should, before answering your really good first questions, I should just thank everyone for coming, especially at a time when I know so many people have so much going on, and when people are zoomed out and have the vice presidential debate and a lot on their minds. I also want to thank Anna, as well as Emma O'Leary. I want to thank the whole Alum Association and so many people in this audience, as well as in the larger Sidwell community, who played a role in the creation of this book in a whole variety of ways, from the actual writing of the work and research in recent years to much longer term influence that so many people at Sidwell had on my life. And so with that, I should also thank Enid. I am really honored to get a chance to share the virtual stage with her. I want to just encourage everyone to check out her book at this defining moment, which, as she said, I had the pleasure of teaching multiple times, in fact. So I encourage you. It has abiding significance in ways that will become immediately apparent when you see the book. There are several ways I could answer the question of why I wrote this book. I think, you know, in a certain sense, I have been a child of war. Like I think many of the folks in this gathering and virtually everyone in our country. In so many ways, from even at Sidwell. Although this image here is of me playing some war game at St. Albans. I believe I'm mounting some sort of fort in a game that it's quite possible someone in this group might have been participating in. At another level, I can explain why I wrote this book with these 5 sets of figures. Today is the 19th anniversary of the US war in Afghanistan, 19 years during which the United States has been fighting war consecutively. Many people know or have some vague sense that there are about 15,000 US military personnel and contractors who've died in the post 9/11 wars, 15,000, no small number. However, the number of people who've died in the countries where the United States has been fighting wars is about 50 times that size. According to the Cost of War Project, 770,000 to 801,000 people have died through direct combat in just 5 of the countries where the United States has been waging war, and the United States government has been waging war in or involved in some form of combat in at least 24 countries since 2001. That second set of numbers is just the number of people who've died in direct combat. If you include indirect deaths, the total death toll probably reaches somewhere between 3.1 and 4 million people. Could be quite a bit higher, a fairly incomprehensible number. So to the number 37 million, which represents the number of people displaced in the 8 most violent wars the United States military has been involved in. 6.4 trillion, that's the total cost as of this month, the total amount of money the US government, US taxpayers have either spent already on the post 9/11 wars or already obligated to spend in the future in the form of veterans benefits and interest payments. Again, it's hard to wrap one's mind around 1 trillion, let alone 6.4 trillion. All of these numbers in different ways, I think, should make us weep, and have made me at times, although I don't think they've made me weep enough, or I haven't felt them nearly enough. But anger about this permanent state of war in the United States, and a certain degree of shame and a desire to change this situation is a major part of why I wrote this book, and hope that the book has some impact in changing and bringing these wars to an end. The one other element I would add is, as Anna so nicely explained, this book does emerge out of 2 previous books, a book about the US military base on Diego Garcia and the expulsion of its indigenous people, the Chagosians, and then a book that looked at the whole network of US military bases that encircle the globe, that bases that now play a significant role in my analysis in this newer book. So in a certain sense, this trilogy of books arises from, and from a relatively narrow focus on one base to the entire system of war.
You know, it's interesting that you were saying that you felt shame and anger about all of this war, having thought about it and done all this research. There are many times that I was reading the book and I just started like marking it up and writing, wow, I can't believe this. And I just wanted to like throw the book across the room because I was so kind of amazed at the way you put these things together that we're all kind of familiar with loosely, but you kind of put it together in a way that's, like I said, really devastating and really powerful. So what, in brief, would you say is the main argument of the book? What's the main thing that you're trying to get across to the reader?
If I can narrow it down, I think the main thing I'm trying to get across is that the United States is a country that has been profoundly shaped by war, and is profoundly shaped by war to this day. That we live in a society that has become something of a permanent war state, or a warfare state, a society that from its earliest days, from independence, has been shaped by war. You asked that question about what was most surprising, which I neglected to answer, but it ties into this question. This is a list of the number of countries the United States has been at war with, or peoples with which the United States government has fought wars or been engaged in some form of combat since independence. So this period since 2001 of continuous war is actually not an aberration at all. It is the norm in US history. US has been fighting, and this is one of the things that surprised me, has been fighting some form of combat or war in every year of its history except 11 years since independence. That's 95% of the years in US history. And so the argument is that the United States has been shaped as a country, its society, each of our lives has been shaped profoundly by war. And that to understand this, we can look at the role that US military bases abroad have played. I look at US military bases abroad as part of a complex of forces that explain why the United States has been fighting so much in so many places, 135 or more countries. And by looking at bases, we can see that the United States has built bases outside its own territory, again, since independence. And that these bases have not only made these wars possible, but have actually made war more likely. I can capture, in a certain sense, the argument of the book by saying, or riffing on the old baseball movie, Field of Dreams. If we build them, wars will come. If we build them, wars will come. That if we build military bases, specifically bases, extraterritorial bases, bases outside US territory, we should not be surprised when wars come. Similarly, the them refers to empire. If we build an empire, wars will come. And indeed, and we can get into this more later, if you'd like. But part of the argument of the book is that the United States has been an empire since its founding. Many of its founding fathers conceived of the United States as an empire and explicitly modeled the United States after the European empires.
Well, let's go to this issue of empire for a minute. I was telling my mom the other day when we were talking about the book that one of the things really has struck me about reading this is I have been used to thinking of the US as an empire, but I realized as I was reading the book that I always had thought of that in kind of a metaphorical sense, right? Like, oh, these actions were imperial, or this is kind of like an empire, right? But when reading your book, I was like, oh, wait a minute, we really literally are an empire. And we were not just an empire in the past, or just an empire for a brief period of time, but we have been an empire for the most of 2.5 centuries, and we still are an empire today. And you also point out in the book that the status of the US as an empire rivals or exceeds that of empires that we're more familiar with, such as the Roman Empire, in terms of power, influence, military might, and brutality. For example, you say that after World War II, US leaders directed tax spending to create the largest budget for the production of violence of any government anywhere ever. So I'm wondering if you can talk about this a little bit more, explain what you mean, in what sense we are an empire, and talk about the role of military bases in particular in exercising, in the US's exercise of imperial power.
A great complicated question. So I would say, you know, I think it's hard for a lot of people in the United States to think of the United States as the empire, or as an empire, excuse me. It was hard for me to wrap my head around. And as I was beginning to read about empire, as I began to read about the history of US wars, this goes back now 20 years almost, when I started my research about the US military. And I think this is because we've been raised, most of us in the United States, many of us have been raised to think of the United States as the quote unquote good guy. You know, again, I was a child of war in many ways, including the Star Wars franchise. And I, like I think most viewers in the United States, saw myself as being part of the rebellion. And in fact, we should have thought of, and George Lucas actually had this in mind, that the United States was the empire. So another way to approach this question, I think, and the fact that it is so difficult for many in the United States to see the United States as an empire, I think, you know, in a certain sense, speaks to the work that Manifest Destiny and the ideology of Manifest Destiny has done on all of us. And yes. I think this 17-second video can communicate this perhaps more powerfully than I can. This is a video showing the expansion of the United States from the 13 states clear across North America, and the disappearance of Native American peoples, nations, lands in the process. It's quick, so I'll show it again. United States, again, oops. Advertising. It looks like a pretty good ad, but I will, as advertising goes. But the United States, yeah, again, has been an empire since independence, and beyond the continent, the United States began expanding, in fact, actually before the conquest and colonization of lands and peoples across the continent that, of course, entailed, as you alluded to, genocidal violence. We have to be frank. Genocidal violence, the dispossession and deaths of millions. That the expansion of the United States then continued beyond North America to islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And today, the form the United States empire takes in many ways is an empire of bases, as some refer to it. That the military base, this collection of military bases abroad, which they now number around 800 US military bases outside the 50 states in Washington, DC, in around 80 countries and colonies. These bases have become a major tool of US power in the post-World War II era in particular. And that is at least one facet of the contemporary face of US empire, along with other military tools, economic tools, political tools that the US government, US leaders, US elites use to exert power.
And you know, you really demonstrate how much control. So it's not just the taking of the land and having these military bases, but like the way that the US is able to so thoroughly intervene in all of these countries because of all the bases that are stationed there. In many ways, this is a story of like now billions of dollars spent on the construction of thousands and thousands of military bases over time. You know, I was surprised to find out that we had hundreds of military bases in Western Europe through World War II. Some of them are large. You said they're like been like U.S. cities. Some of the bases have, for example, in Diego Garcia, have displaced the indigenous populations, also in the U.S. as the settlers push west. And then you talk about thousands and thousands of smaller ones that you today call lily pads that are located on like islands or in rural remote places so as not to promote so much resistance from the population. One thing I'm wondering is, so sometimes we have acquired these hundreds and hundreds of bases by this point through force. But a lot of the time, it seems like you're saying that we acquired them through negotiating deals with host countries. Like you talk about, oh yeah, right after this, the US went and ran around Africa or ran around the Middle East and made all these deals to construct all these new bases. I kind of wonder, why is it that all these countries are continuously letting us in to establish military bases, especially given the fact that it means them completely giving up their sovereignty? Basically, you say for the most part, it's US rule. You know, they're leasing bases to us for 99 years or in perpetuity. They have no control over what goes over on their space. And there's such a long history of clear US kind of military, political, economic intervention in these countries. I just kind of wonder, how have we been able to convince so many countries to let us in to construct these bases, and why are we still able to do that today?
It's a great question. US bases abroad were established and have been established under a range of contexts. Prior to the 20th century, most often it was by context. The first US bases abroad, by conquest, excuse me, it's like context. The first bases abroad were, of course, those occupying Native American people's lands. Conquest, colonization led to the existence of those bases, which then frequently led to further wars, which frequently led to more bases, which led to more wars. And this is part of the pattern I describe in the book. Bases in US colonies, frequently called territories: Guam, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the US Virgin Islands. These are bases that also have been established via occupation and the conquest and acquisition of these colonies. Again, it's fairly unusual for people to talk about them as colonies, but I think we have to recognize that they are in a colonial relationship with the US government and the rest of the United States. And then the bases that you refer to in Western Europe, in East Asia, bases that were built and established often in World War II or the early days of the Cold War, have often been bases in Japan and Germany in particular were established via occupation, post-World War II occupation. But other bases indeed have been established with the consent of local governments, although we shouldn't confuse the consent of local governments with that of an entire populace. In fact, about half of the US bases abroad are located in undemocratic countries, especially bases in the Middle East and many of the bases in Africa. So we shouldn't confuse that. And we have to see the ways in which there are people in the host countries who absolutely benefit from the presence of these bases. Many of them perceive certain benefits that they may not necessarily receive, but often they're very real material benefits that leaders receive in exchange for granting base access. Benefits for themselves, but also for trade relations. Bases have become a major kind of bargaining chip, although part of what I describe is that once a country allows a US base onto its soil, in a certain sense, it becomes something of a Trojan horse. That governments don't realize the power that US officials are then able to exert just with the threat of withdrawing their base alone.
You know, speaking of bases, one thing we realized, or I was very interested to see, you talk about some time you spent at the Guantanamo, Cuba military base on the US side, and I have been to the Cuban military base in Guantanamo. And this kind of relates to the fact that in addition to all the historical data that you bring in, historical documents, maps, military reports, and other kind of government documents, you also did a lot of ethnography. You went to 14 different countries, dozens of military bases, you did interviews, and at one point you describe yourself as standing in the hull of a military aircraft which was filled with wounded soldiers. At one point someone's arm had been blown off. And I'm hoping that you, oh, that's me in the middle. It's me in Guantanamo, on the Cuban side of Guantanamo military base in 1996, early grad school. So I was wondering if you would share a passage from the book that illustrates the way that you integrated your ethnography, because I was really curious in how your ethnography informed your writing. How did you integrate ethnography in this work? And explain how the research you conducted outside of the documents shaped the narrative or the argument.
Okay, so I'll read something quickly. I've already been talking too much, and we do want to get to. We both Enid and I want to get to the conversation and Q&A and discussion. And I apologize for going longer than I said I would to Enid. But to read from my time at Guantanamo Bay, this is what Guantanamo Bay looks like. People have now in their minds the US prison in Guantanamo Bay often. But in fact, the US base in Guantanamo Bay looks like many US bases around the world, like a small or not so small US town, complete with fast food and suburban housing developments, shopping, yoga studios, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even Scooby-Doo, bizarrely, is somehow at Guantanamo Bay. I kid you not. Well, Scooby-Doo I didn't find, but the Mystery Machine I did. So to read quickly, on base, now this is the US base, people ironically describe being locked down. Many refer to the base itself as the island. Until recently, the only people allowed to cross the fence line were a handful of Cuban workers who had been working on base for decades, commuting to and from the city of Guantanamo on a daily basis. The last two recently retired. A small number of Cuban employees long ago chose to live on the base permanently. This generally meant permanently separating from Cuban family members and friends. As non-US citizens, they can't move to the United States. As traders to Cuba, they can't return home to the rest of Cuba. As a result, Guantanamo Bay is probably the only military base in the world with an assisted living facility. Again,
Wow.
I got to visit. The Cuban employees live in a kind of stateless netherworld reflective of the base's ambiguous legal status. In fact, in many ways, I don't think it's so ambiguous. It's been made ambiguous by US government arguments in court and other representations publicly. But Guantanamo Bay, as I quickly, well, probably not so quickly, it took me a while to realize, is a colony. Guantanamo Bay is a base occupied against the will of the Cuban government and the Cuban people, and has been since even before the Cuban Revolution.
Yes.
The base imposed on Cuba during the US formal occupation, de facto control and colonization followed the beginning of the 20th century. This is a map that captures the US colonies as well as US military bases abroad, which we can, in a certain sense, think of as kind of mini colonies. Again, often they're not so mini. The other thing that struck me and was really helpful when I visited Guantanamo Bay was going to a small, dusty museum at the bottom of or the base of a lighthouse at Guantanamo Bay that was pretty unremarkable, and no one else goes to visit it. You have to go get a key at the base headquarters. And in this museum, I found a yearbook, like Sidwell and other schools and camps. Guantanamo has a yearbook, an annual yearbook, and on it were the numbers 1494 and 1964. And I had no idea what this referred to. I asked my guide, who said that 1494 was the year that Christopher Columbus arrived at Guantanamo Bay on his second voyage. The base was celebrating the 470th anniversary of Columbus's arrival. And it struck me as not such a coincidence that Columbus arrived at this base that has become so infamous. It also helped me to see that to understand the history of US wars, you have to understand a much longer history of warfare in the Americas and a much longer history of imperialism in the Americas, the ways in which the US empire emerges from European empires that came to dominate and conquer the entirety of the Americas.
I'm mindful of the time, so we'll be fine. Do not worry. I'll keep us on schedule. Your saying that kind of takes me to this other kind of issue I was wondering about, which was the kind of American exceptionalism. Like, why is it that we ended up creating the biggest, most brutal, expensive military in the history of mankind, right? And with clear imperial aspirations from the beginning. It was just like, oh, we are barely independent. Let's just keep sucking up this land from these indigenous people. Let's see if we can annex this, we can grab that. This is in the interest of our national security. I mean, that discourse has been around for forever. I mean, one thing I wonder is how much of it do you think is related to the process of racialization? How much is it related to resource accumulation, like all the capital that the US was able to accumulate in part by the theft of land from indigenous people and the theft of labor from West Africans in the form of slavery? Also, just in general, if you could think a little bit about the relationship between war and racialization, or empire and racialization, empire and white supremacy. One thing that seemed really clear to me in reading this book is that white hetero patriarchal nationalism seems to be a really strong package here, right? So meaning that when we're thinking about white supremacy in the US, it's very tied up with this kind of nationalist and imperialist vision, like this idea that if you're an American, right, / American white male, you belong anywhere on the earth. Any dark corner of the planet that you might go into is a dark corner that's better for your presence, right? You probably brought some peace, some civilization, some economic growth, some humanitarianism, things like this. So I know I said a bunch here, but I just want you to comment a little bit on that, and then I will bring stuff to a close so we can switch over to the audience.
Okay, I'll do my best, and maybe I'll pick up on some of the themes in the Q&A and discussion. Anything I don't cover in answer to your fantastic and complicated question. I'm actually tempted to call on your brother Malcolm, who spoke to some of these issues in a
very long question. Unnecessarily complicated.
No. But Malcolm sort of cut everything down to size. When I explained that my book a couple of years ago was a book about the relationship between the United States and war. And he said, wait, what do you mean the relationship between the United States and the war? The United States is war. It's like saying a book about the relationship between the United States and racism. The United States is racism. It's been founded on racist principles. And we can see it in the Declaration of Independence that in a certain way combines or speaks to some of your question. You know, the Declaration speaks about merciless Indian savages.
Yes.
Equally, the Constitution, of course, conceived of African Americans as 3/5 of a human being. Slavery was built into the foundations of the United States, and we can see in the words of George Washington, among many others, that sort of genocidal impulse when it came to Native Americans in particular. I've talked a lot about bases so far and given short shrift to capitalism and race. Capitalism is central to this story of US wars. US wars and US bases, whether there's a war or not, US bases abroad, have been tools of business interests, of elite interests, and served often to benefit elite interests. And I could speak to very specific ways in which we can see that, from the fur trade in the 19th century to the commercial airline industry in the 20th century, to the oil industry, of course. In many ways, the US military writ large, bases and all, have been a kind of bodyguard and advance agent frequently for business interests in the 19th century, for individual family settlers, often Euro-American settlers. So that is just the beginning of an answer. I guess maybe just one other way to speak to the role of race. Couple sort of illustrations. One would be, you know, why are so many of these right-wing white nationalist groups, heavily armed groups, fashioning themselves as militias? Many of them, I would argue, are clearly hearkening back to the earliest days of militias in the United States, which, along with the US Army, were central to the conquest of North America, central to the dispossession of Native American peoples and the death and destruction that accompanied that. Similarly, we can look at the frequent use of racial slurs in the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This has a long history too. Slurs originally used to describe African Americans and Native Americans get applied to Iraqis and Afghans. I'd prefer not to mention the specific slurs, but you can read about them in the book. And we can, in between that, we can see the very similar and sometimes the exact same slurs, the N-word, for example, being used to describe Filipinos when the United States conquered the Philippines and then engaged in a long, bloody, torturous war between 1899 and 1913.
Well, and a lot of this, you know, the slur and the racism is connected to constructing these peoples as others in order to be able to justify the complete denial of sovereignty, the taking of the land, the theft of land, the theft of bodies, the deprivation of liberty, right? And so, for example, you know, my dissertation was on Cuba, and there was all this talk about from the US military occupiers around 1902, around the first occupation, about how Cubans were not fit for self-rule. And part of it was on the grounds that they had this mixture of African blood and indigenous blood among them. So I'm gonna turn this over to our illustrious audience, but I just wanna mention some of the other things that come up in the book that they maybe want to talk about. So there's so many ways that your argument potentially ties to this moment that I'm really interested in knowing, you know, what you would think. So you were writing this through the beginning of this year, but there's ways that it ties to like where we are right now in the COVID crisis and our national response to our current politics, the presidential election, to the renewed fight for racial justice in the United States. And we're going to allow the audience to ask about that if they want to. And then the other thing that's really important is your discussion of solutions, or what we do, because you end the book on kind of a hopeful note. And you say that in order to end endless US wars, we must work to de-imperialize the US most of all. And so I'm sure that people will love to know kind of like what that means and what other kind of solutions you advocate. but I'd like to thank you, David, for talking about the book. And I want to open it up for a Q&A.
Thank you.
I'm going to mute myself.
I'm excited for the questions ahead and
So
comments.
I do have one question that came in through the chat. And I know we had several questions that were submitted ahead of time, which some of which you've touched on. Would you like me to throw in a couple of the questions that were submitted prior, or David, I'm going to leave that to you.
Sure, yeah.
I also think it would be cool to allow anyone who's here who wants to pose, their own question, because we have like 15 minutes, so that might be, but.
We don't have any hand raised as of yet, at least via the chat, but I see one hand up right now. Let me, Mauricio, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, thank you everybody for this. This is just incredible, and it's wonderful to see so many faces who I haven't seen in a while, so hello everybody. David, I had a quick question, and you have talked about this before, on various news sources and probably in past books, but can you speak just briefly about where Enid's taking off, which I think is really important, how the military industrial complex, how we've been had as a country because of that complex really making us believe we're Americans first, but really, the militarization occupation does bring up issues about race and gender and feminism and all these politics. In the US, I feel like we're seeing an occupation. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about how our police force and our cities have been sort of turned into these kill boxes, if you will, for government to treat us as if we're the outsiders. And it's usually an attack on women, people in the LGBT community, and people of color. I don't know if there's anything you talked a little bit about how or why that's happening.
I guess my short answer would be to say that, thank you for that amazing question, Mauricio. My short answer would be to say that wars fought abroad have always been intimately connected with wars fought at home. Wars, as you said, fought against people of color, wars fought, and here I'm using wars a bit metaphorically, but violence committed against people of color, violence committed against the working class folks. One example of these connections from the time of the US war in the Philippines, in fact, there's one officer in particular who, if I had more time, I could quote from, but who fought in the wars against Native American peoples in the US West, what's now the US West, then went to fight in the Philippines, and then proceeded to return home to put down a strike in Chicago. He also was at Wounded Knee in 1896 and part of the force that massacred hundreds of Lakota Sioux there. So that would be my short answer. Yeah, and I'd love to talk to you about it more, because that is just the beginning. Anna, do you want to read the questions that were already posed?
Sure. So one question that we got in the chat tonight was David asking you if you could talk about how you see this US version of imperialism overlapping with the idea of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, in a way, the United States is, well, in so many ways, the United States is not exceptional, but in its relationship to imperialism, the United States is like other empires past, in that US leaders have frequently portrayed the United States as not an empire, of course, but as justified in its use of violence, justified in its use of war, that its use of violence and war have been for humanitarian reasons, for good reasons. And the United States, again, US leaders are not unique in this. The King Leopold of Belgium justified the horrific violence that Belgian forces committed in the Congo on humanitarian grounds. So certainly in the last century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, empires have tended not to portray themselves as empires and instead have tended to portray themselves as exceptional, as justified in whatever acts they may seek to pursue.
Thank you. One question that we also just got through the chat is, what would Europe look like today if the United States had not won World War II or had not been steadfast in the Cold War?
Great question. I mean, the short answer is we don't know. There's no way to know. So, you know, in a certain sense, I mean, I guess I wonder what motivates the question. I sense that, because I've gotten similar questions a few times before, asking about basically good wars, and World War II frequently gets portrayed as the good war. And one of the ways I think my book is different, it's not a book about battles and discussing war to war, the intricacies of each war. But one thing it does do is put an emphasis on the human and environmental damage that wars inflict, especially the human damage. That it's my belief that we can't really think of any war as a good war. How can we think of a war as a good anything, a good thing, when World War II took the lives of somewhere around 60 million people? To characterize that as a good war seems really troubling to me. Similarly, I guess I would say that by portraying any war as a good war, it shuts off analysis. It engages in a kind of either or, it's a good war or bad war kind of portrayal that doesn't examine why the war was fought in the first place and what mistakes were made that could have prevented the war in the first place, that date, of course, in the case of World War II, to World War I, at very least. Steadfastness in the Cold War, you know, this speaks to part of that steadfastness that many would point to would be the presence of hundreds of US military bases and hundreds of thousands of US military troops in Western Europe, facing off against the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. Again, there's no way to redo history, but there is, you know, these troops and bases were there to prevent a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. There is no evidence, in fact, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union ever planned to invade Western Europe. In many ways, the presence of hundreds of thousands of troops and hundreds of bases in Western Europe may have exacerbated the tensions of the Cold War, made nuclear war more likely, and cost the United States tens of billions of dollars over the whole course of the Cold War, likely actually running into the trillions over the whole course of the Cold War, which I referenced the trillions that have been spent since 2001. I would just remind everyone the $6.4 trillion should be deeply painful to us in that money being expended and the lives that were lost as a result of the wars the United States has been engaged in. At the same time, we have to think about what the United States did not invest in when it invested $6.4 trillion in war. COVID alone underlines the priorities that the US government, that US leaders have pursued, and the misguided, in my mind, and I suspect the minds of most people listening, misguided priorities. The US military didn't protect us against COVID. The US military didn't give us universal health care that could have cared for people who contracted COVID. We have been totally unprepared. Much of the blame for the hundreds of thousands now of deaths to COVID absolutely lies, should be attributed to Trump and his cronies. But much of the blame, much of the responsibility actually lies in a longer history stretching back many administrations that involved prioritizing war and a warfare state over the kinds of welfare states that other wealthy countries that have done much better in this COVID pandemic have built over time. That was a long answer to a great question, and hopefully you didn't feel like I dodged it.
Thank you. I have a couple more that have come in through the chat. One is, what level of base presence do you think is needed for deterrence? And do we need any presence abroad at all?
So when Enid alluded to solutions, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. But one of the solutions I would propose, I think first we have to think in the broadest structural terms. We have to think about dramatic change if we're going to change this problem. And I think actually in the moment of the COVID pandemic, the ability to create dramatic structural change exists in ways that it simply did not 9 months ago, or I guess a year ago, let's just say a year ago, before the COVID pandemic. The pandemic creates opportunities to create change of a dramatic nature when it comes to healthcare policy, military policy, and far beyond. I think we need to examine the need for every single military base abroad. Any base abroad that is not increasing the security of the United States or the world is one that is wasting money, distracting the US military, and endangering the world in a whole variety of ways. I would argue that almost every base overseas should be closed. And an increasing number of people across the political spectrum share this view. I've probably been sounding like a crazy lefty for much of this almost hour, which anyway, that's not, I want to speak to the broadest possible audience. So I'd love your feedback about ways to speak more effectively in the future. This is the first audience really I've been able to speak to about the book. But people across the political spectrum share my view that US bases abroad are not an effective way to protect the United States, or actually distracting the United States from pressing needs, both militarily and needs like healthcare, housing, education, our schools, crumbling infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure I missed a dimension of your really good question, so I apologize. If you can remind me, Anna.
Yes, and this came from an audience member. What level of base presence is needed for deterrence, and do we need any presence abroad at all? Yep.
Yes. So that has been the argument, or one of the main arguments for maintaining literally hundreds of US bases abroad since World War II. This is a Cold War era policy. This is a policy that grows out of World War II that we're still using 75 years later. And I think it's long outdated. And again, people across this political spectrum are increasingly agreeing with me that this is incredibly outdated and dangerous and wasteful strategy. The deterrence argument is you need to have these bases overseas to deter enemies. I'd say two things. One, evidence in the scholarly literature does not support that claim. People have just made that claim for 75 years without any evidence to back up the claim, or very little evidence to back up the claim, especially to support such a broad policy. So that's one thing I would say. Secondly, let's think for a moment how we would feel if there was, let's just say, a Russian base or a Chinese base near US borders. How would we feel? How would people in the United States respond? I think it's clear people would call for a military buildup and some kind of military response if there was a Chinese or Russian base in Mexico or the Caribbean or Canada, for example. Meanwhile, there are literally hundreds of bases surrounding the borders of Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea. US leaders portray them as defensive, just there for the protection of the world's peace and stability, etc. I can pretty well guarantee that Russian leaders, Chinese leaders do not feel secured. And in fact, these bases are in many ways increasing patterns of militarization, encouraging China in particular to build up its military forces which in a whole variety of ways run the risk of setting off what would only be a horrifically catastrophic war between the United States and China. And in terms of priorities for the future, I think avoiding a war between China and the United States has to be an urgent priority. There are too many people who are already in policy circles and military who sort of take it for granted that this is going to happen, which is a horrific thought, given that these are two nuclear armed powers. I'm cognizant of the time. Last thing I would say about the deterrence argument, we need only look, we don't have to just hypothesize how would it feel if Russia or China built a base near US borders. The Cuban Missile Crisis, we're about to come up on the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the most dangerous moment in the Cold War when Russia built a single missile base in Cuba, a single missile base 90 miles from Miami. Meanwhile, again, Russia's borders were surrounded, and the Soviet bloc's borders were surrounded by literally hundreds of bases belonging to the US and its allies.
Thank you so much. I know we are just about at 9 o'clock. We do have one more question if you are willing to take one, although I know folks may want to head and watch the debate, but
I'm definitely willing to take one. I will not dance. Some of my friends in high school when I worked at Johnny Rockets would they'd come and make me dance because they knew the particular song you had to play to make the waiters dance. So if that's the question, I won't do it.
it is not, it is a real question.
Okay.
So I'll ask this one final question. This person was asking if you could speak to the question of settler colonialism in particular, and if you think that this body of theory or analysis is useful for understanding the US's war system, both internally and externally focused.
I think it could not be more important. And in terms of, Enid's good question about, things that I found surprising in my research, my ignorance was probably number one. In many ways, writing this book was a project in re-educating myself about the United States, about US history, about US history of war. But my ignorance and ability to simply move Native American peoples out of my consciousness for the most part, despite working with a group of indigenous people, the Chagosians, for 19 years now, despite many things, despite living in a city, which is itself a kind of colony. We are second-class citizens in DC. A city called the District of Columbia. Why is it called the District of Columbia? Why do we call Columbus Columbus? Why is in the one case an anglicized version of a name that this person never used? He used the Spanish version, Colón, and a Latinate version in Colombia. Why is there this celebration of a conqueror, the first person to build military bases, foreign military or European military bases or Euro-American military bases in the hemisphere, and who set off a process of conquest and genocidal destruction? The degree to which the violence of the wars between the US Army and US militias and Native American peoples, the degree of violence, the genocidal nature of that violence so frequently, that shocked me and saddened me that I was not more aware of that, and not more aware on a daily basis that the land we are sitting on is occupied territory. I'm in both occupied native territory now, sitting in California. I'm also, of course, in occupied Mexican territory. The US claimed nearly half of Mexico during the Mexican-American War, a war US leaders instigated.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's a really funny book.
Yes, it is.
No, the last thing I would say is it does end on an optimistic note, and I would love to talk more to anyone individually, in a group, in any setting, about the book, about the ideas in the book, your ideas. I really appreciate deeply everyone being here tonight, and it's so great to talk to Enid and to talk to everyone.
Well, thank you both very, very much on behalf of everyone who's here and from the school as well. Thank you so much for sharing of your work with us, David and Enid, yours as well. That is the book. It is out on October 13th. We appreciate all of you joining us tonight. I know there's lots of different things that you all get invited to and have the opportunity to participate in, and we're just so appreciative of your being part of events like these. There's a number of conversations with friends, events coming up on the calendar, so keep your eyes open. And just thank you again so much. We appreciate you being here.